evening in Greensboro. I want to welcome you to the final report of the Caspian Lake Watershed Action Plan that we've been working on for the past 2 or 3 years. First of all, I want to thank the Orleans County staff. We've had multiple folks involved over the past 3 years for initializing the process and writing the grant to get the money to do this work. And I want to thank Dana and his team. I know he's worked with some other consultants and for the great job that they've done in this report. I think it's really outstanding. So thank you. I also want to thank the fellow members of the stewards, which are our group. And I also want to point out that we're stewards of the Greensboro watersheds. We're not stewards of Caspian Lake because we're concerned with water quality across Greensboro and places downstream that we impact by how we take care of our water here. And I also want to thank all the landowners who have given us access to their properties so we can do the assessments that have been completed. And a thanks also for future involvement potentially in this process as we go forward, actually with implementing the Lake Watershed Action Plan. So you can go to the next slide, Sarah. So why are we here? I don't know if people have seen this, but Lake Watershed Action Plans are done, and lakes that have been doing the action plans are stressed in one way or the other. If you look on the right, this is the scorecard that the Department of Environmental Conservation gives for Caspian. And it shows primarily we have a stressed shoreline, meaning it's highly developed. And we also have a significantly increasing phosphorus trend. If you look at the left-hand graph with the little dots, it's the phosphorus levels when we started taking the measurements were between 5 and 6, and now they're up around 10. And so this is the reason why we got the money to do this work and the reason why we need to keep going forward and implementing the Lake Watershed Action Plan. So I'll give it back to you, Sarah. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Joanne. Okay. So, let's see. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Damsel. I work for the Orleans County Conservation District as the district manager. And our role in this project has been to, like Joanne said, to secure the funding and work with the stakeholders of the Caspian Lake watershed to lead this effort. So we hold the grant agreement and we hold the services agreement with Dana and his team. We also hosted multiple stakeholder meetings and did follow up to those meetings, and then conducted the Lakeshore and Lake-wise assessments and just have been involved kind of shepherding the process along. So I wanted to just start off to kind of like share the goals of our meeting, which are to communicate the results and the next steps and really kind of focus on that in the final report, provide a space for folks to ask questions and feedback on the plan as it's presented today, and then to implore folks to continue to be involved, as Joanne had mentioned. So our agenda for that is Joanne already did kind of the welcome and introductions. I'll give a high level overview of the Lake Watershed Action Plan goals, process, and outcomes. Dana will have the bulk of our time today to go over the report goals, outcomes, and recommendations. And then we'll have a few slides just about next steps, again, trying to implore folks to continue to engage and continue to be involved. In between all three of those, we'll have a space for you to ask questions. That will happen in the chat. So I guess I'll take this second just to talk a little bit about the logistics of the webinar. This is my first experience hosting a webinar. You all, I'm sure, are experiencing all of your cameras and mics are turned off for this webinar experience. You are able to raise your hand and, kind of do those actions, I guess they're called up here, the reacts. And then when during that question and answer period, if you open up the chat, so if you go up in the top ribbon, I assume most people are experienced in this virtual space, but if you're not, you go up to the chat, you hit on that chat icon, and then the chat ribbon over to the right will show, and you'll be able to type in your question there. Bevan, who works for the Orleans County Conservation District as our outreach and lake shorelands coordinator staff, will read your questions during that question and answer space, and then we'll do our best to answer those. So hopefully that makes sense. And you can always put questions in there as we go. You don't have to wait for that space, but ideally we can kind of keep it clean that way. But if something definitely comes up, you can pop something in there. Let's see. Oh, this meeting is being recorded. If anyone's uncomfortable with that, I just want to let you know that right now. We do plan to host this recording on our webpage so that others can view it. I do have a couple polls for you all. So the poll will pop up in your space here, and then you can just ideally click on that poll, and it should be pretty self-explanatory. I will say too that I'm going to email everybody all these slides and the final report that Dana has for us. So you don't need to frantically take notes if you are that type of person. So don't worry about that. I'll send all of that to you. So that's kind of like the outline that we have for our time today, which brings us to our first poll. So I'm interested to know who is in the space with us today. So I'm going to, if I can get to it, launch a poll. And like I said, I'm new to this, so hopefully it goes well. Okay, so Joanne, do you guys see that?
No, Sarah, I don't think we're seeing anything right now.
Oh, you guys don't see it.
Sarah, I can see it.
Oh,
Well, maybe that's because I opened.
I see who's in attendance poll.
Okay,
That's it.
hang on.
Hmm.
Sarah, should I try? Let's see it. It says it's live.
it's live.
Close poll. It's in the side. Is it only in the chat, Sarah?
Maybe.
Does everyone have the chat open?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see people are saying it's in the chat area. It's in
Oh,
the
great.
chat, folks are saying. Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks, people.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
So everyone
Thank
sees
you.
it now?
Yes, it looks like people are doing it. Oh, great. Wonderful. Nice. Yeah, we've got 4 responses, 5 responses. Okay, so those are coming in. Nice. Okay, so I think I can continue on. I think that will stay in your chat for those of you who haven't had a chance to get there. Oh, it looks like people wrote it in there. If you could scroll all the way up to the top for the folks who just wrote it in there, and you can actually click on the one that you are and submit your vote, and it'll be really easy for me to collect that data. If you guys could just scroll all the way up and get up there, you'll see it. There we go. Yeah, we got some more coming in. Okay, perfect. Okay, moving on. So I am just going to go briefly over what a lake watershed action plan is. We did go over this at a couple of our other public meetings, but the goal of this project is to assess the lake watershed and identify sources of increased stormwater runoff that would contribute to increased sediment and nutrient loading to the lake. And then also really important part of it is getting input from the community on the prioritization and the feedback on, the results in the report that's produced, which is, our part of our goal here is to, gather you all's feedback and make sure everybody's, involved along the way. So definitely community engagement is a big part of this. And then I also wanted to just say that for the Orleans County Conservation District, the goals for us is to work closely with the stakeholders to generate awareness and interest in resolving potential problems, and also highlighting projects with multiple co-benefits in the community. So throughout this whole process, we've been working closely with the stakeholder group, and, projects that kind of floated to the top. Sometimes there was, pretty robust conversation about how those particular projects have added co-benefits around, raising community awareness or multiple different sectors that are going to benefit from a project, those sorts of examples. The other goal for us is, to work with our partners to build trust within the community for the sponsoring organizations. I think especially, as the stewards of Greensboro are really kind of, spearheading quite a lot of great work. I think that trust building piece is a big part of what we are working on. And then provide support to access funding for implemented selected projects and management practices, which is what, a lot of what Joanne and I were talking about earlier. So the Conservation District provides a lot of that type of support to, bring projects from, ideas through fruition. So that's kind of an overview there. Going to the next slide. So just an overview on the process so far. Again, this is a similar slide to what we had presented in August for those of you that joined us at the August meeting. But essentially, we're 2 years in. The plan is finalized. And this will be our final meeting, kind of focused on the Lake Watershed Action Plan. And I wanted to mention here that at our meeting in August, it just had some interesting outcomes. We had 44 folks in attendance, and we conducted a survey, and one of the results of the survey that I found really interesting was that in this community, the greatest barriers to implementing clean water projects is time and knowledge. And so that's definitely something that, the internal stakeholders to this process, the state, and folks like us, it's good information for us to have in terms of, tailoring our technical assistance and stuff. So that's just an overview of what we've done so far. And then a brief, I'm not going to read this whole slide, but I will briefly touch on some of the outcomes that I see for us. And Dana is going to talk more about some other, the other bigger outcomes that are in the report. But we did host 6 internal stakeholder meetings, and the stakeholders were folks from the town, folks from the Stewards of Greensboro, Conservation District staff, and DEC staff. And so we met at, intervals throughout this process to provide feedback to Dana to guide where the resources would be spent in terms of our grant dollars, and what assessments would be prioritized, what projects would be prioritized, things like that. And then we do have 34 projects identified. And wanted to note that if these were implemented, 148 pounds of phosphorus would be removed. And Dana has more of that data to share with you later. But I do think that, the outcomes of this work can definitely make a difference. And wanted to also say that these are not the only projects to be done, that there are 170 projects that were identified during the desktop and field assessments that could have further development. And then, all of other things too. So, and I also think it's important in my last point here with the final report, that, a high rate of precipitation, you know what I mean, is key for voluntary projects to address non-point source pollution, because non-point source pollution is everywhere. So again, our plea to have you all continue to be involved is an important part of this work. Sorry, I advanced that slide. So at this stage, with a couple slides presented so far, I just wanted to check in with the chat to see if there's any questions on what's been presented so far.
Sarah, Jennifer Andrews said there's people trying to attend. We have to admit people.
I don't see anybody. I set the meeting so that there was no waiting room. Everybody should be able to bypass a lobby, if you will. So I don't know, Jennifer.
There's currently no questions in the chat. I did invite people to start writing questions in the chat.
Okay. Well,
So maybe we can proceed.
yeah. So Dana, I'm going to stop sharing and you can share yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. Let me just share my presentation screen real quick. Okay. Allow. Are you able to see that? Sorry, it doesn't look like it.
Yes.
Yes. Yes,
Oh,
I
you
can
are.
see it.
Weirdly enough, I'm just seeing Sarah. So
I know that's what happens when you present. You can't see the whole thing.
Teams is the least favorite platform sometimes. All right, that's fine. Anyway, so as Sarah said, I was the leader of the consulting team that developed the Lake and Watershed Action Plan for Caspian. Becky Tharp of Just Water Consulting and Elise Lawson were also collaborators on a lot of this, and then MSK Engineers helped us out with some of the concept designs. And so it was really a great team effort. And Sarah sort of mentioned this already, but real briefly, we'll go over what exactly is this whole concept of a lake and watershed action plan. And it's really an assessment to identify the greatest threats to a lake ecosystem. So impacts on water quality, wildlife and habitat. And primarily this is from stormwater runoff, from altered, cleared or converted shorelands, as well as stream banks and other environments within the watershed. And so this action plan basically includes a list of prioritized problems and solutions. And so you can actually see this is the table that we developed. This graphic here is the table that we developed for Caspian for some of these prioritized projects. And we'll talk a little bit more about the scoring later, but really that's what we're driving at, is creating some sort of priority list. And what are the project goals here? Well, overall, as was mentioned earlier, phosphorus is increasing in the lake. And so that's something that we want to address. We also want to address sediment. Sediment has a negative impact on aquatic habitat, while also carrying nutrients such as phosphorus. Creating riparian habitat that also protects water quality as well as just the habitat creation itself. Restoring lake shoreline to a more natural condition. Reducing stream bank erosion, so that's also a sediment and phosphorus concern, as well as resiliency of our stream banks. We saw a lot of flooding this summer, and so if we can reduce stream bank erosion, we might be able to reduce impacts to adjacent properties. And creating more resilient roads. Roads are also part of a lake and watershed action plan. They do contribute some sediment and phosphorus at times, as well as stormwater flow. And so actually creating more resilient roads not only improves water quality, but it also improves or reduces the need for operation and maintenance on roads. So it has a co-benefit there as well. And so when we talk about reducing phosphorus to the lake, if we were to implement the priority projects within this LWAP, we'd be looking at about 148 pounds of phosphorus. And that translates to potentially roughly 37 tons of algae produced annually. So this is not a one-time savings of 148 pounds of phosphorus. This is every year, forever, as long as these projects are built and maintained. And that's a lot of potential algae blooms in the lake. Will it happen every year? Maybe not, given climatic conditions, but it eliminates the possibility. So that's huge. We're also talking about 350 cubic feet of sediment annually just from lakeshore projects alone. So not looking at road, wetland, or stream projects, but just from lakeshore projects, we've got a big sediment reduction. And again, that has a negative impact on nearshore habitat, aquatic habitat. We'd be talking about creating 25 acres of riparian habitat between lakeshore and stream-based projects. So that's a significant chunk of high quality habitat adjacent to these aquatic ecosystems. 780 linear feet of shoreline in a more natural condition at about 50 feet wide. So again, that factors into our riparian habitat creation, but that's also a significant chunk of the lake shoreline that would be returned to a more vegetated, forested condition from where it is currently. We didn't specifically model stream bank erosion, so I don't have a figure for that, but typically stream banks are more dynamic than a lot of lakeshore environments. And so I think we'd be looking at a similar, if not much greater, reduction in sediment annually as with lakeshore projects. And then if we were talking about the road projects, we'd be bringing 1.65 miles of roads within the Caspian watershed alone up to municipal road general permit standards. That's a statewide permit for water quality for roads. And that's a significant mileage, especially these segments are 100 meters long. So it's a lot of 100-meter segments that would come up to standard. So how do we get there? Well, there's some basic steps in this process. First, we want to know what data is out there. So we create a data library, looking at previous resources that have been assembled. Then we look at a lot of publicly mapped data and create some of our own data to do what's called a desktop assessment to get an idea of initial targets just on the computer, just using mapped layers. And then we use those mapped layers in this desktop assessment to go out into the field and do a field assessment. This field assessment, allows us to get eyes on the actual conditions, think about management practices that would really help that particular location. That allows us to do some modeling and some cost estimation, which then feeds into our prioritization process. Once we have some priority sites and we have some landowner buy-in for these sites, we then move to concept design, where we actually put something on paper that could be implemented for that site. And further refine designs and costs. So that's the basic process in a lake and watershed action plan. So without going into the details of a lot of these things, because it is a rather long process, our data library, all of these assets for data library or desktop or field prioritization, it's all in what's called a story map that's accessible online. It has a lot of detail. And so those links are embedded in this report here. They're in the final report as well. We've put them all together. They're all findable in one URL. So you can go to one place and see the data library and the desktop and the field, as well as the final action plan, which summarizes all of those. So if you don't want to read the details, skip to the final action plan, the last tab in the whole thing, and that'll give you the overview. But if you want to delve into the details, they are here and you can check them out. So for the data library, what did we look at? Well, primarily we looked at land use. We looked at roads and roads assessment associated with that municipal roads general permit. We looked at a lot of different stream assessments. There have been many done over the years. And we also looked at the water quality data that's available from the Vermont Lay monitoring program. And from that, we were able to get an overview of some of the conditions within the watershed. And some of the takeaways, just from a high level here, are that the watershed itself is predominantly forested, it's over half forested. So that's generally a good sign. If you combine tree canopy, so the forested area, plus grass and shrubs and water as well, Caspian Lake itself is fairly large. That's about 97% of all the land use in the watershed. So this is, a fairly undeveloped watershed, all things considered. That's not to say that it doesn't have development in areas that we're not concerned about. But overall, we're looking at a fairly forested watershed. Just a note on the grass and the shrubs, that does include pasture land and farmland. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. We also did this road data analysis. Again, this is taken from the Municipal Roads General Permit, or MRGP. Again, that's a statewide effort to bring all of these hydrologically connected roads, so roads that are connected to water, where their runoff from the road surface goes directly into an adjacent water body like a wetland or a stream, up to some sort of standard that will help improve water quality as well as protect the road. So it's mostly town roads within the Caspian watershed, about 60% of them. 34% is driveways. We do have, I said mostly gravel, 33% is not mostly, but 33% of the roads within this watershed are gravel roads. And so those are generally of a little bit more concern because of their tendency to erode and contribute both sediment and phosphorus. Paved roads tend to contribute less sediment, less phosphorus at times, but are still of concern. So we looked at all of that for the roads. Basically, the way that the MRGP works is that it breaks things into segments, 100-meter long segments, and then it ranks them and basically says either the segment does not meet, partially meets, or fully meets the standards of the MRGP. If it fully meets, that means it's probably fine from a water quality standpoint, at least as far as the MRGP goes. If it does not meet or partially meets, then that means there's work to be done, whether it's crowning or ditching or some combination of the two. So those are the ones that we focused on because we couldn't focus on everything. We also checked out for our streams, something of interest to us. Vermont DEC used the high resolution land cover data produced by UVM in 2016. And this is really high quality data. And they looked at the land use within 100 feet of all these streams because we wanted to see what we were dealing with as far as this 100-foot buffer. Typically, a 50-foot buffer is the absolute minimum necessary for water quality protection. 100 is preferable, and so that's why this analysis was done. And we found again that tree canopy makes up the majority of land use within 100 feet of most tributaries. That's not to say that there aren't areas that we're concerned about, but overall, that is generally speaking a good sign. So that's good. And then we can look at priority areas where tree canopy doesn't make up the majority. We've already seen this data, but we are looking at a shoreline condition that is disturbed or highly disturbed with water quality trends that are seeing increasing phosphorus. The lake is not in a eutrophic state, so overly loaded with nutrients and therefore more likely to cause harmful algal blooms, blue-green algae, and things of that nature. But we are seeing an increasing trend. And so this is a great time to actually get involved and do some of these projects and protect some of this land because we don't have a problem necessarily yet. We're not seeing these algae blooms that you're seeing in some other lakes. So this is a good time to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we wanted to look at that data to inform us. You're seeing in this map the phosphorus data. So there are some hotspots. We're also looking at this just in general to get a sense of, where is the phosphorus coming from off the land? And so even though most land is forested, this is data from Porter Brook, which is the largest tributary to Caspian. Even though most land is forested, that still has a phosphorus load. So you still have organic matter flowing down from that watershed into the streams and then into the lake. That's about 15 to 20%. And keep in mind, too, that the land area associated with forested land in the Porter Brook watershed is the majority of it, but it still has, a fraction of that phosphorus load. Now, we then look at roads. It's a relatively small percentage of land use. You can kind of see in the gray here that that's the land area for roads. But that's associated with about 15% of the total phosphorus load from Porter Brook. So even though it's a small percentage of the overall land use, it is still contributing a decent amount of phosphorus. We see the same thing with cropland and pasture and hay. That's about 30% of the TP load, the total phosphorus load, but a relatively small percentage of the overall land area within the watershed. And then same with developed land. Developed land here, we're looking at this little slice of the pie, kind of that rose color there. So a relatively small percentage, but it's about 15% of the total phosphorus load. So all of this to say that there's not necessarily one source. There are multiple sources for phosphorus to the lake. And so we have to be critical and look at all of them potentially. So that's the data library process, basically giving us an idea of what we're dealing with within the watershed. So it's a really important foundation. We also looked at the Caspian Lake Protection Committee annual reports. There's a couple feeder stream studies. Like I said, the lay monitoring program for streams as well. We also looked at soils, topography, and wetlands. This gives us an overall idea of what kind of soils there are within the watershed. Are there areas of steep slope or flatter areas? And then what are our wetlands? Because wetlands are important for protecting the water quality. So once we had assembled all this data, that essentially gave us the basis for doing the desktop assessment in 4 core areas. So the shoreland, so right around the lake shore, the streams, wetlands, and roads. And from there, we were able to start looking at a lot of these different mapped factors and knowing some of this background and start to pick out sites that we thought could potentially have an opportunity for some sort of water quality improvement. So for the shoreland area, we picked out about 87 sites total. That can be seen in this map here. This map is online as well in that story map. So if you want to go and check that out, you can see all of this data there. One of the important part of this process is that we actually basically made a combination of any area based on that 2016 land use data that was quote unquote not canopy. So not forested area. So it could be cropland, could be pasture, could be developed. And we also created a slope map for the entire watershed. So we were able to combine areas of not canopy and any areas over 15% slope. And so in these orange areas on the screen, that's what you're looking at, not canopy and greater than 15% slope. And we essentially said that those areas are slightly higher risk because they're not in a, quote unquote, natural vegetated condition and they're steeper. So they potentially generate more runoff, more erosion, and therefore potentially more phosphorus to the lake or its tributaries. And then we went around the lake parcel by parcel, looking at that layer and looking at the potential opportunities and then noting these. You can see these points on there. And we gave them an initial priority where it seemed like, okay, this is a small parcel. There's not a lot of not canopy high slope area. Maybe that's a lower priority. This is a larger parcel. There's a lot of not canopy and a lot of higher slope. Maybe this is a higher priority for some sort of lakeshore project. So that was the initial process. And from that, we got 87 sites. We did the same process for all of the tributary streams, essentially as well. So again, that not canopy layer in the higher slopes area, we just looked at it within 50 feet. Again, 50 feet is really that critical water quality buffer. So we came up with 33 sites on the desktop from that, and we also gave them a preliminary ranking. So again, using that same process. For wetlands, we did a slightly different process where it was a combination of looking at the Vermont Significant Wetlands Index, that VSWI, and the Wetlands Advisory Layer, and then did a windshield survey in the watershed using this desktop data plus some, from the public right-of-way observations, and came up with 10 sites total in the desktop assessment, gave them an initial priority. And then for roads, again, we took all of those road segments. And since the road segments are only 100 meters long each, we said, okay, let's give them a slightly different ranking and let's group them. And so you can see here, all of these different colors represent road segments that are slightly different priorities within the MRGP. And we just grouped them together and said, okay, you know what, if they do a road project, it's going to be one big road project that happens, probably all at once in this area. So let's group them naturally like that, where they touch. And then we have a more cohesive set of projects. So we have 11 total sites for roads, about 57 segments, 3.5 miles of roads evaluated in this way. So then once we had that desktop assessment done, we were able to actually go out into the field and look at some of these sites and then prioritize them. So for shoreland, we looked at 98 different sites in the field using the boat around the shore tour method. So looking at them from a boat, taking some photos and getting some basic assessment data. And of those 98, 17 were chosen for a prioritization. Same for streams. We were able to get out and look at them, from the windshield survey essentially. And of those 33, 10 were prioritized, 3 of the wetland sites were prioritized, and 5 of the road sites were prioritized. And again, if you want to know more about this field assessments and prioritization method, we've got a lot of details. There is a lot that goes into this. Briefly, we'll touch on it. It's essentially a cost benefit analysis to some degree, where we assign each site a water quality score, so a phosphorus reduction in kilograms reduced per year. We give that an additive score, so 1 through 4. We then try to figure out how efficient is the project. So we give it an efficiency score. So the less it costs, the higher a score it gets. That's additive. We also have these additional benefits scores. So things like operation and maintenance requirements. Would it mitigate flooding? Does it enhance or create habitat? Things like that. And those are all additive characteristics. And then really one of the most important factors, though, is the landowner score, and that kind of comes at the end, and that's a multiplier. And so all of these scores prior to are added up. Then at the end, if we know we have landowner support, or we suspect that we have good landowner support based on stakeholder knowledge and outreach, then that whole thing gets multiplied by 1, the score stands. If we don't think we have landowner support, or it's unknown, we give it a score of 0, and that score goes to 0. So you can imagine what that would do to that project and the prioritization, drops right out. And so that's really key in this entire process, is that we want to get landowner buy-in. And so many of those sites from the desktop assessment that were then assessed and then prioritized, that was the result of working with the stakeholders in the project, giving them a list of all of these potential sites and saying, here's the data, here's the ownership data from the statewide parcels database. Based on your local knowledge, which of these owners would be willing and potentially able to work with us, or who do you suspect would have a conversation with us based on some of these projects? And so that's really how we arrived at many of these, because we really wanted to make sure that landowner buy-in was there before progressing too far down the road. So, and then there's just some information on this slide about how this was modeled and that sort of thing. We won't go really too far into that. It's all outlined in the document. So what's our effectiveness? Well, realistically, we broke it up into our 4 core areas for those prioritized projects. And again, this is 150 pounds of phosphorus annually if all of these projects were implemented. And the majority of our reductions come from stream-related projects. About half of the overall reduction comes from stream-related projects. And then it's fairly evenly split between road, shoreline, and wetland projects for the rest of the projects. So just wanted to, further give a distinction and categorization for that data. Again, landowner willingness is key. We did talk about a cost benefit analysis, and you saw in that prioritization table that willingness was a multiplier. If it wasn't there, the score went to 0. So we tried to make sure that, we had willingness with all of these projects. And in selecting the final 5 projects, it wasn't necessarily the prioritized sites that had the highest score that advanced, so what the numbers said for the top 5 in the cost benefit aren't necessarily the top 5 projects that progressed to concept design. And that's because we wanted to work with landowners on some of them. We had input from the stakeholder group, where they had knowledge of certain landowners and their desire to participate or their desire to catalyze. And so some of these projects advanced because of buy-in. And so the final 5 projects, some of them do have multiple sites. So those desktop field assessment sites per project are essentially these. And so we have one group site, this WET 005 ST3, which is a combination of a wetland and a stream project. ST7, which is a stream-based project. That's the code for that one. So over on Lakeshore Road, that general area. And then we have 3 shoreline projects, LS32, LS29, and LS25. And so there's more information on those on the website. But we're briefly going to talk about one of those concept designs. And that one is LS29. And so that's actually Lisa Armstrong's property. It's a relatively steep site. We were able to get out there and check it out. There is a decent amount of phosphorus reduction associated with returning some of the shoreline to more naturalized conditions, as well as some other practices, which we'll talk about in a second here. And so this was a field assessment, which then informed our concept design. And the concept design, which we'll show you now, is fairly simple, but very effective in what it does. And so what we're looking at here is we have essentially a return to a more naturalized condition of part of the lawn area, so regrowth of native vegetation. That can be very important. This is a steeper area. It is a wet area. It does receive runoff from part of the driveway. And so returning it to a more native vegetated condition is going to take up more of that water. We do have some areas of maintained lawn in this area, but it has kind of crept wider and wider over the years. And so maintenance of that access to the shore is important, but we wanted to make sure that that was a little bit more defined. And so we're working on that to define that area. Probably the most built aspect of this are these infiltration stairs, and we have a detail to show you after this. But infiltration stairs are actually quite simple. They can be made out of rot-resistant timber and gravel and or crushed stone. And essentially they replace a steep section of path or maybe an eroding stairway that does allow for water to run down an erode and transport sediment and phosphorus potentially to the lake with stairs that capture water. So each step allows water to infiltrate into the ground. So you're not creating that erosion, you're capturing water on site. We are also advocating, and this is something that the landowner expressed interest in and desire to do, in moving the existing boathouse back from the shore slightly. So, about 10 or 15 feet, give or take, and then actually planting these live stakes. Live stakes are essentially just small shrubs that are planted into the soil that will then grow up into shrubs or trees. In this case, I think we're talking about shrubs for maintenance of access and view. But that's going to renaturalize a portion of that shoreline. And then in this area here, we're talking about allowing regrowth to occur, because if you can see on the satellite imagery, that's a little bit, it's been maintained over the years. So allowing that to grow back up in taller, woodier vegetation will capture more runoff and stabilize the shoreline a little bit more. And so real quick, we'll talk about this detail, but this is a little bit technical here, but what we've got are these stairs. You can see there are timber elements here, and there's crushed stone in between. And essentially we're just providing for these flatter pads where water can infiltrate into the ground. So they're very simple, but very effective, something that most contractors or homeowners can probably build on their own. And the Lakewise manual actually has some good guidance on that as well. So let's see. I think, Joanne, or Chris, you have a letter from Lisa to read about the process.
Yeah, sure. Just thanks, Dana. Just to introduce myself briefly for those that don't know me. Many of you do. I'm a Greensboro resident. I live on the lake, and I'm also one of our watershed stewards. Lisa wanted to be here, but she's actually in a different time zone. So even though we're on Teams, it makes it tricky for her. But I did speak to her, and she was, as Dana said, one of the 5 priority projects. And just to we wanted to get a feel for what she thought about the process. And she'd been worried for some time, in particular about her boathouse. With the rising water levels in Caspian Lake, it was being undermined to some degree. And so the consultations she did with Dana, she found extremely helpful to come up with the plans that he's shared with you. She feels, she feels confident in what's proposed. And she did go through with me some of the detail that Dana's already been through about what she has planned, so I won't repeat that. Her next steps are to really work with an engineer to look at the boathouse in particular and the detailed planning around that, and begin to obtain some of the permits. And she's very enthusiastic to get going as soon as possible. And as she says, to finish off, she's really glad to contribute in whatever way she can to the quality of the lake. And I think that's reflected by all of the landowners that are involved in these high priority projects. So that was it, short and sweet.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. I appreciate that. All right. Well, I don't have too much more. But we're now getting into the action part of the action plan a little bit. So where do we go from here? And I think Sarah's going to address this a little bit more, but I wanted to talk about it as well. And we have some specific recommendations, but I kind of break it down to implement, progress, and fund. So implement, let's try to get the first 5 built. We have some concept designs. There are some cost estimates. Some elements can be done relatively easily. So those can progress. Then use the priorities list to conduct outreach. The story map online for the action plan, as well as the written report, the two mirror each other in content, have specific actions associated with many of the priority projects beyond the top 5. And so those can be used to start, conducting some outreach and getting some interest in potentially moving forward. And then fund. There is money out there for implementation. So there's funding to potentially implement these first 5. There's funding to implement the next 5. We do go into a number of those funding sources. Clean water service provider funding is one option, but there are many others as well. So this isn't something that is impossible to achieve. There's actually money behind this, which is very different from the landscape 10 years ago. We actually have a means by which to accomplish this. So that's really actually very heartening in these processes. We have some general recommendations, and one that we wanted to start with is just climate smart planning. We are experiencing climate change right now, and so I think that we have to look at this as we move forward. So does that mean a different growing zone for some of this riparian vegetation? Does it mean more freeze-thaw cycles for our roads? Does it mean more precipitation? We did have a pretty serious event this summer in July that taught us a lot about localized flooding and how patterns may be changing. And so we've tried to incorporate that where we can, but I think in any of these, looking at local knowledge and dealing with the facts on the ground are going to be very important. And another thing that we heard during the August 30th stakeholder meeting and that we've been aware of is the need to work with dam stakeholders on lake level. Working with the dam stakeholders is outside of the Lake and Watershed Action Plan process that we have dealt with thus far. And so that's not something that this plan specifically addresses. We do have some commentary from people who are familiar with that process within our prioritization, some of our reporting. But that's going to be important working with those stakeholders on this issue. We are aware of it and we know it is a source of concern in the watershed. So we do have some general programmatic recommendations, one of which is social marketing, utilizing the Lakewise and Streamwise platforms to encourage more people to adopt, more robust naturalized buffers along the lake and stream. I know there's a lot of interest around the watershed in Lakewise as well as Streamwise. And so continuing with that work is important. There's also the option for owners who are not directly on the lake shoreline or on a stream to participate in Storm Smart, which is essentially a non-jurisdictional way of looking at stormwater and helping homeowners improve their properties to control developed land runoff. Greensboro has an excellent shoreland protection zone around the lake shoreline. But that could be considered, or that could be extended to the tributaries potentially if there's willingness to do that. That could help protect some of these tributaries from development encroachment. The Vermont DEC has river corridor protection bylaws, and while these tributaries are too small to have what's typically thought of as a river corridor, they do have recommendations for smaller tribs such as these. Similarly, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns has a model stormwater bylaw ordinance, or model stormwater bylaw, not an ordinance, that could help with some stormwater issues in and around town. So again, not just the lake shoreline or the stream banks, but also develop properties, away from the lakes and streams, because those can have an impact on groundwater, which does translate to base flow for your streams and your lake. So that does have an impact as well. Lakewise has a program called a Septic Social. I think the name actually changed and I forgot to update it. I think it's now called a wastewater workshop. But you know, we are aware that septic systems are of concern in the watershed. And while assessing individual on-site wastewater treatment systems is outside the scope of lake and watershed action planning, because that's a very separate jurisdictional element, Lakewise does have a way to talk about making sure that people are keeping up with their septic systems, their wastewater treatment systems on site, so that they are functioning as well as they can be. And then support the town's work with the municipal roads general permit. This is something that the town is obligated to do under a statewide permit. And so support could look like watching, you know, looking at the town budget as far as their projects go and seeing, you know, are there projects within the Caspian watershed that can be supported in some way? You know, and just generally encouraging the town to adopt these roads best practices. So, you know, that's sort of the programmatic, the higher level stuff. We also have a bunch of stuff that, you know, we feel like is very achievable for the individual and the do-it-yourselfer. And one of the things that's very simple, and one of the things that we see, you know, in the Caspian watershed as well as elsewhere, is the need to adopt no-mow or low-mow practices on the lake and adjacent to streams. So instead of mowing the lawn right up to the stream or shore or lake edge, consider not doing that, letting native vegetation grow up. It's one of the simplest ways to improve water quality. And it doesn't have to be no-mow, it can be low-mow, so letting it grow longer than 3 inches. This improves root uptake, this improves soil health. There are a lot of benefits. So that's a very simple thing, and you literally don't have to do anything, you have to do less. There's an excellent guide, and this is a link. So again, it's linked in this, it's linked on the story map. The Vermont Guide to Stormwater for Homeowners has a lot of good suggestion on how to manage runoff from developed lands from residences. And along these same lines, you know, removing any development within 50 feet of the lake or stream, this is really helpful. And again, lawns and pasture land do count as some level of development. The natural condition is usually forested, and so letting it reforest can really be beneficial. Same for, you know, hay pasture, minimize the hayed area near streams or on the lake. Really, you're looking for about 50 feet is the minimum. More is generally better, but 50 feet will make an impact. Lakeshore retaining walls are a big one. Can you actually make that wall be alive by planting things in it or replacing it somehow? So instead of a concrete wall, perhaps it's encapsulated soil lifts or gabion baskets that are planted. Really, you're looking to improve the root structure in these near shore areas so that you get more soil retention as well as more nutrient retention in that critical zone. Maintenance of septic systems is very important. Even if they're not failing or broken, maintenance can have a big impact. And encourage your neighbors kindly to adopt similar practices. You know, I think everyone really appreciates the lake. And so spreading the word, getting some peer-to-peer marketing, you know, time and again, that's been shown to be very important. And so the last couple of things that we wanted to mention too are consider conserving your lands. You know, if you have a larger tract of land, considering conservation can be really important. Maintaining that forested land use throughout the watershed is going to have an impact on water quality. And join the stewards of Greensboro Watershed. They'd love to have you. So with that, that concludes me. I'm happy to answer questions. And I'll let, I guess, Sarah, you're mediating questions. Are you monitoring chat and that sort of thing, I guess?
Or Bevan?
Yes, I think Bevan's going to monitor the chat for
Or Bevan.
questions.
Great.
Okay.
The first question I found in here is, I might edit it a wee bit just to make sure it makes sense. What percentage of phosphorus I would think would be removed versus what makes it into the lake annually? I think what this person might. I did edit it a wee bit.
That's an easy question to answer, and unfortunately, the answer is I don't know. Because we didn't do a mass balance for the entire watershed, so we're not exactly sure what is going into the lake in total. we did talk about, do we have that data? Because that's actually, it's an easy question for me to answer because I don't have the answer, which is a consultant cop-out sort of answer. But it's a hard question to answer because it does require modeling the entire watershed, and then try to figure out, given the land use and the flows and that sort of thing, what are we seeing for an annual mass balance going into the lake? And to my knowledge, and we did search for this research, that hasn't been done. It has been done for some lakes. I mean, Lake Champlain, we know more or less what's going into the lake every year. For certain lakes within the Lake Champlain Basin and elsewhere, we do have an idea. Unfortunately for Caspian, I don't think that modeling has been done. So while it's great to say that we can remove 150 pounds approximately of phosphorus per year, I can't tell you what percentage that is, of what's flowing to the lake. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that some level of nutrient flux is absolutely normal for a lake ecosystem like this. So we certainly don't want to achieve zero phosphorus, because then we've removed phosphorus, which is a basic building block of like all cellular organic life, from the aquatic ecosystem, and then plants and animals start dying as a result. So the goal is not zero phosphorus. The goal is some level of phosphorus, which keeps it at a normal level, at a baseline level. So that was a lot of words to say. I'm sorry I don't have an answer for your question directly, but I hope you understand why.
All right. Here's another great question. It's the person said, I have assumed that phosphorus mostly comes from laundry discharge from residences. And how do roads compare to that? I think you probably answered their question about roads, but maybe you could just address the laundry question.
So interestingly, Vermont has had a phosphorus ban in detergents since, oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong. We've had a ban in place for a long time. So we're actually not seeing phosphorus from things like soaps and detergents and things like that, because of that ban. That was a legislative action that was done decades ago now. Phosphorus is, like I said, it's, basically it's a building block of cells. Like every cell wall needs phosphorus, to have structure. It's also a main transport mechanism, an ADP and ATP within, I'm not a biologist, so I have a water quality researcher's understanding of this stuff. But, basically like transporting energy within living things, so plants and animals. So when you think about phosphorus sources, really think about things like organic matter, compost, lawn clippings, leaves that fall from trees, things like that. Are road surfaces themselves a source of phosphorus? In the case of a gravel road, relatively small fraction of what's in a road surface typically, because we're talking about gravel. Typically, gravel is like an inert silica matrix, like sand, but you're going to get native soils mixed in there. Native soils do have an organic fraction. Leaf litter and things like that have decomposed over time and become part of that matrix. And so you can have the road surface itself being a source of phosphorus due to sort of like these native soils being mixed in. You also get phosphorus from roads because of the flows that come off the road. Those flows can erode ditches. They can transport material that are on the road. So again, leaf litter, organic matter of any type, all of that has a phosphorus fraction. Plus, once those flows start to get into streams, then you start eroding stream banks. Stream banks do have a relatively high organic matter content. Think about where the best farming land is. It's always next to streams where a lot of flood deposition has deposited nutrient-rich soils. We're talking about phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium. So once we start eroding those stream banks and floodplains, then we start liberating a lot of this phosphorus that has been sequestered there for hundreds of years potentially. So it's relatively complex, but think of phosphorus not as something that like comes from chemicals within our houses, although that can be a source, and think about it as something that we see all the time in, again, lawn clippings and leaf litter and compost, waste. Manure is a big source. Human waste is a big source, because again, we're processing a lot of nutrients every day, and some of them we pass through. And that's, again, that's an issue with some, septics that are failing and things like that, as well as the manure that we find associated with, certain agricultural activities. So that's the world's cheapest primer on phosphorus. But that's kind of a quick and dirty view of it.
Sarah, did you want to add anything?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Next question. How can farm fields up Gebby Road be best managed to limit phosphorus runoff? And Chris Steele had a quick response I could share as well to that. But you want me to start with what Chris said?
Sure.
Yeah, Chris mentioned the Streamwise program is working with landowners, advising on buffer development around tributaries in the watershed, including Porter Brook.
Yeah, that's a great response, honestly. Streamwise is a great response. We do have priority projects in that watershed off that road. And so there are certainly some that have been identified as potentially having opportunities to, maybe look at some practices and improve water quality there. So yeah, Streamwise is a great starting point. This report is a great starting point. So I think there's plenty of opportunities within the watershed.
Yeah, I would add also that a lot of the sort of DYI recommendations that Dana mentioned are good and applicable to the agricultural settings in some senses. Like he mentioned, looking at the conveyances and the streams on those parcels and increasing the buffer. So if you are a landowner that, rents out to the Gebbies or has them, manage your fields, that's one thing you could work with them on that. If they're open to it and if that works for your relationship with them. To do a setback. All farms are required to follow the required agricultural practices, which requires, manure spreading setback. And then if they're growing any corn, there's additional setbacks. And I know that, there are farmers in the watershed and around the state that are also looking at manure injection, which I think is definitely applicable and useful, especially on hay ground. So those are some practices that our farmers are looking at. And, farmers of their size and stuff are definitely following a nutrient management plan. And so if you do have land that they crop, talking to them about their nutrient management plan might be a way to kind of start a conversation. And one kind of innovative thing also is, the no mow zone or the reduced mow zone is a similar scenario with, a hay field. If a hay field is cropped right down to the nubs, run off if they go and spread right after that. And so, working with them on potentially raising their blade, cutting their hay field is, one thing to consider also.
All right. A few more questions. How much more time do we have, Sarah?
5 minutes.
Great. Does phosphorus settle in the lake bed? Maybe you could just talk about that quickly.
Yeah. All right. So lots of phosphorus questions. You guys are dragging me right back to grad school. Okay. So two of the basically what we're concerned about with phosphorus, right, are mostly is what we call like dissolved reactive or soluble reactive phosphorus. That's the fraction of total phosphorus. So total phosphorus is any particulate phosphorus as well as the soluble fraction that gets transported. So TP is generally the larger amount, right? And that's what we're modeling in a lot of this. Particulate phosphorus, as the name suggests, will usually settle into the lake bed. And that will then form a part of the lake bed substrate. Over time, soluble phosphorus will liberate from that. And that's the form of phosphorus that is then available for things like vegetative uptake. So when we're talking about algae blooms, essentially when phosphorus goes into solution in the water, the primary producers, these little algae cells, go crazy and eat it because that's their food. That's the limiting nutrient. Usually there's not enough phosphorus in a freshwater ecosystem. And so when you get a lot of phosphorus, you get a boom cycle of algae. And so that's that soluble phosphorus. So a fraction of the phosphorus is left in the lake bed, and a fraction of it is liberated into the water column. And that's what you're seeing, sometimes when you get algae blooms. Is this always bad? No, it's not always bad. We need some phosphorus. We want plants in the lake to be able to uptake phosphorus to grow. That's a normal part of the process. When we get too much of it and we get that boom cycle, that's when we have a problem. Total phosphorus, like particulate phosphorus, is not usually a problem when it's not in solution, right? So when we're talking about soils on a stream bank or adjacent to a stream that are generally speaking dry soils, they're not being transported in the water, that's kind of inert phosphorus. We're not so worried about that. What we are worried about is when that, total phosphorus, that particulate phosphorus, gets eroded into the stream, then you get potential liberation of reactive phosphorus. That's what we're concerned about. So yes, we get settling on lake bed, and then we also get some dissolving into the water column. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and Karen Bates put information, a bunch of information and links for learning more about phosphorus, and we'll make sure we put this in the follow-up email.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for doing that, Karen, because again, not a chemist, so there's a lot more nuance to this, but yeah, appreciate
Great.
that.
And there was another question about whether we'll post information for grants and funding. We'll definitely get that available as well. I think that will be in the follow-up email, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
There was one more. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that information, a lot of it is on the action plan on the story map in the funding section. So we do have links to a lot of those funding sources as well. So if folks get to that via the links in the presentation, they can find those.
Perfect. Great. There was one question that I'll just go ahead and read it. Can the Watershed Action Plan include a recommendation that the town better enforce lake protection criteria? And we hear this a lot about enforcement, and I'll read the full thing. There has been lakeshore clearing lately that violates the requirements, and no enforcement action has been taken so far.
Can the Lake and Watershed Action Plan say that the town should, what was the first part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, just that, can we add that as one of our recommendations, that the town enforce lakeshore protection criteria?
At this point, we're done with the drafting of the action plan. I think it's good to note it's not typically something that a Lake and Action Plan delves into in terms of jurisdictional efforts. And it's sort of assumed that the enforcement action would take place, whether it's through the town's ordinance or bylaws, or through like DEC's shoreline protection rules. So, I think it's something that the Lake and Watershed Action Plan doesn't specifically comment on now, and I don't think we're going to edit it at this point. But it is noted, and I know that there are people here who hear you. So I think that's my final answer.
Anything to add, Sarah?
No.
Any thoughts on whether the lake will get warmer in years to come? If so, will that increase the possibility of algae blooms? So climate change question.
Oh, to be totally honest with you, I don't have the temp data in front of me, and I don't recall exactly what it showed. I think there is temp data from the Vermont Lake Monitoring Program. I think that's one of the parameters that they do measure. So I can't say definitively yay or nay. Is it increasing right now? I don't know. Generally speaking, from what we've observed in Vermont, I would say that there's a good chance that that does occur. And what we've seen from Lake Champlain with warming waters, warmer temperatures, air temperatures during the day, and sometimes calmer winds, those all promote algae growth within Lake Champlain. And so if those conditions exist in Vermont generally, then yes, the risk is certainly there. So I think, yes, the trends indicate generally within the Lake Champlain Basin and elsewhere that is a possibility. And it's something that when you're considering climate in planning for things like this, definitely makes it more pressing to think about adopting some of these water quality measures.
And I can see that Karen Bates is saying yes and yes to
Yeah.
the questions about warmer waters, and if warmer waters are good growing conditions for algae.
Karen has more succinct answers than I do.
There are a few questions about the dam, so I'm just going to consolidate them. And I apologize if people don't like me doing that. How does the rise in water level affect the retention of phosphorus? Let's see, that's a combination. How can we get help from states and towns for ameliorating the dam problem? Yeah, kind of goes on. Let's see here.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that's a.
So as far as the dam and phosphorus flux, I wouldn't really know how to comment on that as far as like, does the lake level rising have anything to do with how much phosphorus either stays within the lake or leaves it? What we can say is that fluctuating lake levels does have an impact on shoreline. I think everyone knows that. And so as far as the Lake and Watershed Action Plan goes, making the shoreline more resilient to those lake level fluctuations, whether they're associated with the dam, whether they're associated with flooding and precipitation changes, or more precipitation and runoff from the land surfaces. I think that is really the takeaway from this, is that making that shoreline more resilient is important. As far as, how to work with the dam, again, engaging with that stakeholders, we're engaging with the dam stakeholder. And to my knowledge, that's the Hardwick Electric Department. Is that correct? And then the dam safety program within the state of Vermont. Those are the two entities that have jurisdiction over this. And so beyond that, it's really up to them as far as management decisions, and then the community needs to weigh in with them.
One road question said, for prioritized road project RD1, is there any current plan to support the town with that work, since there is no landowner in that case?
So actually, there is a bit of a plan to support the town in that work. In a way, the town is the landowner in that sense. But there have been discussions with adjacent landowners about potentially allowing for additional stormwater BMP development outside of the road right of way that would take runoff volume and any sediment and phosphorus and essentially try to manage some of it in sort of a dry detention ponds, maybe an infiltration-based practice if the soils work. But there are conversations about supporting the town's efforts there. It wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the MRGP permit standard, but it would provide additional water quality benefits for the lake that would go above and beyond the MRGP standard. And that's actually really encouraging, because oftentimes we don't see landowners willing to work with road-based projects because it's not their land, it's not their runoff. And in this case, we do have some initial willingness and conversations around that. So that's very encouraging. So hopefully that does help the town on some level, push projects forward in that particular area.
All right. There's a couple other comments, but I think there's one last question. Is, quote, run of the river, unquote, an appropriate solution?
I don't know what's meant by the term run of the river.
Me neither. Maybe Jennifer could write more about that.
I think it has to do with
yeah.
the dam. Was her original comment as it was in relation to the dam?
Yeah.
I see. Okay. I don't know how to answer that. I'm not an expert in dam operations by any sense, and I'm not familiar enough with run of the river to really make any sort of statement or answer a question. Yeah.
I think that's it for now. I think we do have another 5 minutes at the end when we could do more questions. Sarah, is that correct? So if people
Yes,
think
we
of
do.
more, great.
And I did just
Um,
want to mention quickly, oh, sorry, Dana, go ahead.
I was gonna say I can stop sharing now if you need to share screen.
Yeah, sure, I can share
that-
screen.
Okay.
I did want to mention quickly, just going back to the roads question. So these resources to provide 30% designs were really prioritized for landowners to utilize Dana's services and the grant funding that we have, just recognizing that there are a lot of other existing resources to support the towns to do design work and to implement projects through multiple different other avenues. So I did just want to like voice that for the folks that are here that work with the town on that kind of thing. We do hope that the prioritized road projects that are in the project summary sheets do get picked up by the town and do utilize those existing resources kind of in the name of, implementing this Lake Watershed Action Plan. So I just wanted to voice that quick. So I'll share my screen again. Oh, all the way back at the beginning. So, thank you, Dana. And yes, thank you for, that's great information. Everybody seems to really appreciate it. It's really nice. So I just wanted to talk quickly about next steps and ways to get involved. I think, the Greensboro watershed is a really fortunate community to have really active people and active groups and ways to connect seemingly pretty easily compared to other places that I work. And so I just wanted to recognize that you do all, live in a great community. So, getting in touch with your neighbors and talking with your friends and finding those avenues they're definitely there for you. For folks that do have lakeshore or streams or wetlands and are looking to potentially have an assessment done and look at potential project development. There's a couple of different avenues. I think, the conservation district can support that work through our capacities. And then also with the stewards folks, they have been getting trained up and lake-wise assessments and stream-wise assessments. So you can kind of look into those. If you Google both of those, lake-wise or stream-wise assessments, there are definitely, internet spaces that kind of explain the general concept of those programs and the steps that would be taken for those assessments. And I think at this point, if you're a lake shore owner, reaching out to Allison Marchioni, who works for Lakes and Ponds DEC division on the Lakewise program, to line yourself up for a Lakewise assessment, as well as the local hero, Stu Arnold, to also be involved with that Lakewise assessment is a good place to start. And then for the Streamwise, Jed Pfeffer has been really working hard with lots of people, Joanne and others, to launch Streamwise within the community. So they have all those tools now. They've been trained to conduct those assessments. And so that's really the first step, is to getting those assessments completed. If you do have wetlands and you are interested in a wetlands kind of site visit to understand, possible restoration opportunities and potential, funding sources and technical assistance to conservation districts, our staff can support that. So definitely, that first site visit is the first place to start. And then with the results of that, both the Streamwise and the Lakewise would provide, a pretty comprehensive report on what the results of the assessment are to help you boil down, like, what are the priorities, what are some options, typical BMPs. And then from there is, if you're interested in securing funding, is to work with either, the stewards of Greensboro, who could help secure funds, or the conservation district or the conservation district. Or, you could do some of that work on your own, of course. So that's kind of like a basic overview of like the sequencing of project development to implementation. There's obviously a lot of like stages along the way, and, you know, understanding your goals as a landowner and understanding the limitations of, you know, your property and your land base and all of those things. So there's a lot of kind of making the sausage to, you know, thread the needle. And then of course, identifying the appropriate funding source, which again, we'll make sure you guys all have access to kind of the laundry list of funding sources that are available. Other ways to get involved, which all have already been mentioned, is to just volunteer more, do some outreach and education, talk with your friends and neighbors, have your property considered, if you're open to it, for a conservation easement with the Greensboro Land Trust or other land trusts that the Greensboro Land Trust have relationships with. And I will have a slide at the end with everybody's contact information. And again, I'll be sending all of this to you. And then I just wanted to mention, of course, with these next steps here, with the 30% designs that Dana has provided with us, we'll all be working with those landowners who are interested in moving forward to bring those projects to fruition. Excuse me. Here's a simple breakdown of the funding opportunities. Dana's final report that he referenced has a much more comprehensive kind of explanation of what all these different funding sources provide and what the goals are. But this top ribbon is kind of like the sequencing, project development, sometimes. So there's a project development phase. And then there's the design phase. And so sometimes we need to get 30% design depending on the complexity, or we need to go to 100% design, or sometimes it's simple enough that we just need to go straight to implementation if there's, you know, straightforward BMPs. So then there's implementation funds, and then there's operation and maintenance funds. And so down below here, there's the list of funding sources, and I have Clean Water Service Provider listed twice. So up here is Clean Water Service Provider. They'll fund all of these things. There's the Conservation District Trees for Streams program, which will plant in riparian areas. Similar grant through the Watershed, United Vermont, Woody Buffer Block grants, DEC enhancement grants, which are grants that are basically made to sort of dovetail with Clean Water Service Provider, I guess is the simplest way to say it. So it has similar goals as a Clean Water Service Provider, but it's meant to kind of fill in gaps where the Clean Water Service Provider is not a good fit, because the project doesn't necessarily have you know, overly high phosphorus reduction goals, but has a lot of other potential benefits that could really be highlighted for the community and other priorities. And then there's the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which can be paired with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that program is also a riparian buffer program that is directly targeted toward agricultural lands for farmers and landowners that have farming activity on their lands, to essentially enter into a 15-year easement agreement with the USDA to reserve that ground, to protect the waterway, but then also to enhance it. So that program will also pay on top of the easement rental payment is what it's called, for those 15 years. We'll also enhance it by putting in fence if it's needed to fence out any livestock, and then also plant riparian species. So that's a general overview of the funding. Just wanted to share quickly, Dana mentioned some of this already, but the Vermont Bioengineering Manual is really kind of like the Bible when you're looking at BMPs and when you're applying for funds. You know, all of those BMPs need to follow that guidance in there. Sharing the Edge, a guide for landowners, is a really great resource. And then the Shoreland Erosion Control Certification course is really geared toward folks that are contractors that are doing work, dirt work and other work on lake shores. So tell your contractor friends to sign up for that. We have been doing a lot of outreach to contractors, trying to funnel people that way. They do get listed on the DEC's website as folks that are certified there, so it can bring them, you know, potential income. And then I'm going to hand this off to Joanne to share her next steps slide.
All right, thanks Dana and Sarah for all of the information. I know it's a little overwhelming, so really you should go to the web and look at the report or look at the storyline and take time to digest the information, because it's really a lot to comprehend in an hour or so. And I just put some next steps for the stewards. Again, we have already things that we've done. We have the successful Lakewise program. We just submitted a grant to increase and widen our Streamwise program. We've had a couple of septic socials. The bylaws for shoreline protection, there's new bylaws that are hopefully going to be implemented soon. And if you haven't been down to the beach, we put an educational kiosk at the beach, and with money from the town through ARPA. And we've taken a lot of the information that exists about Caspian Lake, and it's at the kiosk. So going forward, I think for me, the biggest thing is we need to enlarge the working group beyond the stewards. We have a ton of work to do. And I think if we broaden the working group, or call it maybe implement a Lake Watershed Action Plan implementation team, that would include the town, somebody from the town, somebody from the Conservation Committee, the Planning Committee, probably the Land Trust, and you. I think, it's really important for everyone to get involved. I think everybody can do something on their property to improve water quality downstream. I love the DIY slide that Dana put together, which is in the report. So I think, there's a lot of work to do. We have a big plan and a lot of work to do, but I think if we all do our part, work together, we'll be probably putting something out in the spring to get a bigger working group going to tackle this. So thanks for your attention, and thanks for your interest in water quality.
Thanks, that was great.